Oh, are we talking about the Manosphere again?
But those people may be forgetting the many times Andrew has bragged about paying off Romanian police.
Aggression is often considered a valuable trait amongst men. The ability to be tough and show those around you that you are a credible threat should someone choose to challenge you. You are ready to respond with force.
Seduction as a game, while pretty broadly accepted in general society, is heavily pushed by pickup artists who view interacting with women as having specific rules, dominant strategies, and winners and losers.
Somewhere in this jambalaya of foolishness, there are a few morsels of value, because as I alluded to earlier, a lot of these men are working class black men who often are maligned in the media and rarely are defended, or at least effectively defended. Numerous forces and barriers in our society deny black men victimhood in life.
I honestly had no idea. Well, last I checked, I'm a cis man, and I've been one long enough to see the very real and egregious damage that men can accomplish when they're really feeling themselves. Colonialism is undeniably patriarchal, and the systems that were put in place as a result have created its own environment of toxic masculinity that has permeated society ever since. I've seen the likes of Tate, Nasheed, and Samuels my entire life. Loud, obnoxious, misogynistic black men who seem to dedicate their entire existence to affirming their own fragile conception of masculinity. And let's be clear, it is very fragile. I want to make that point up front so that if there's nothing else you take away from what I'm saying here, you get this. Centering your masculinity on the autonomy of women, the superiority of men in society, or your sexual conquests, or for that matter the price tag of your clothing, or how many traditionally masculine traits you exhibit, does nothing more than betray a fundamental weakness at the core of your being. If you truly are a man's man, then gender equality should have no negative effect on you. Feminism or secular womanism should have no effect on you. The existence of trans people should have no effect on you. You would think that all of this stuff should be obvious, and yet it's a real, pervasive issue. A lot of people are talking about how young men are being targeted by grifters and weird, esoteric, hypermasculine thought leaders like the guys I mentioned earlier. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I have all of the solutions. But what I do know is that none of this is new. None of it is new at all. People like this have existed for years, and boys who fall victim to it have existed for a long time as well. I've seen people like this my entire life. I played college football. Football players are at once the biggest and toughest yet most insecure people you'll ever meet. It's honestly really weird if you ever talk to them, because you have these people who are just pinnacles of physical fitness and strength and speed, and yet the slightest thing will damage their egos and send them off into a testosterone-fueled conniption. But again, it's not new. Ever since the first pale skins set foot on these shores, they have brought with them a very toxic and very destructive form of masculinity, and our society has never really recovered from it. For the entirety of the existence of this country, there have been people in marginalized groups who have sought not to dismantle that colonized system of gender dynamics, but instead take ownership of it themselves and weaponize it within their own communities. There have always been people who looked at the harsh oppression exacted upon them by white settlers and decided that they themselves wanted to become the oppressor. Goodness, am I rambling? Okay, let's get back on track. Let's look at some of the elements in place that led to the online environment we have today, and let's see if we can take all of the collective analyses that we've seen on this topic and figure out where to go from here and what to do about it. Spoiler alert, it's going to have a lot to do with capitalism and restorative justice. But you knew that. You wouldn't have tuned in otherwise. No one will ever say that I'm not predictable.
I don't believe. Don't message me about depression because I don't believe it.
So she gave Russell Wilson the impression, she waited a year to sleep with him, and she gave him the impression that she was a changed woman. Now, after she gets the kids and the resources, she's twerking on Instagram. I think that's disrespectful as a wife.
You're all losers.
If you give yourself a 5, that's average.
Yeah.
So, average looking women tend not to get high earning men. They tend to get average.
Think about every slave movie you've ever seen. I know they're played out. I know. I'm honestly tired of prestige black cinema being centered on black suffering. At this point in history, if people really want to know about the true atrocities of chattel slavery in the transatlantic slave trade, there is no shortage of resources out there. If anything, I'd like to see more focus put on the years that followed the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery and its abolition, so people could learn more about just how pervasive the efforts were to keep black people subjugated in this country. But I'm getting off track. Think about every slave movie you've seen. Roots, Glory, 12 Years a Slave, Harriet, Django Unchained, I guess. What do they all have in common? I'm going somewhere with this, but not where you think. In each of those movies, and probably a ton more that I can't even remember right now, there were black people in chains, African people held in bondage in North America to perform mundane tasks against their will, treated as human property. Every one of those movies also depicted the very real occurrence of some black people being promoted to the role of taskmaster or overseer, or in the case of Harriet Tubman, violent and brutal runaway slave hunters. They were black men themselves. I think there's something to that. There's something we can learn from that because it does have a basis in reality. It is a sad and unfortunate truth that's just part of the history of this continent, but I will come back to that. Pretty much all cultures on Earth have some form of gender dynamics and gender roles, some more fluid or vast than others. The very rigid, strict, and oppressive gender dynamics that we see the results of here in the United States are a decidedly European and Christian phenomenon. You can ask any native or indigenous person that studies this sort of thing, and they will tell you that, historically, their societies had far more of what we would consider progressive views on the subject of gender and sex than what we have now, especially before European incursion. Cultures in West Africa and places like present-day Ghana and Nigeria were also known for having very different gender roles than the European societies that would ultimately invade and tear through the continent. This isn't to say that there weren't things that were considered women's work versus men's work. This isn't to say that there weren't limitations based on someone's gender. However, there was a much higher level of respect, level of appreciation for the work that was done by feminine persons in the societies. After all, raising the next generation of warriors, scholars, and leaders is no easy task. We all came from mothers, and many of these older societies recognized that, and it was not at all uncommon to see matriarchal societies on the African continent, as well as on the current continent where we now reside. All of this is to say that when the English and the Spanish and the French and the Dutch and the Portuguese all began their massive colonial expansion, they were operating already off of very strict and oppressive gender hierarchies. These are societies that had progressed into Christianity, and moreover, the organization of those societies was very male-centered. So naturally, when they decided to roll up on foreign shores and take over land and kill natives and establish their own colonies, they imported these gender dynamics that they had back home. Now, there are many stories to tell here. Native and indigenous people could tell you all about how settler colonialism destroyed their much more progressive system of gender dynamics once it took hold. That is not my story to tell. I am a descendant of slaves. My story to tell is about the black diaspora here in the United States and the effect that the transatlantic slave trade had on concepts like gender and masculinity. Africans in America experienced a two-pronged attack on their gender identities. First of all, men were targeted to be emasculated in the eyes of their owners. They did not want strong men with a fighting spirit. After all, you don't want a passionate warrior for a slave. So they forced men to watch African women and children as they were torn from their hands. Black men were beaten and tortured and assaulted and then made to do menial labor in the fields for hours on end, existing as little more than property. But here's the thing that often gets left out of the conversation. Black women were basically treated as broodmares for their slave owners. Their children were born slaves, and it was very common for them to be snatched from their hands not long after delivery so that they could be sold to become future property as well. And they were often impregnated by their white owners. But unlike the white women who lived here, they saw no rest as payment for having a child. As soon as they delivered, they were back in the fields working with the men because they were not seen as feminine. In the white society, they were not seen as women. They were just more property, except that they were also expected to raise children and keep the home as well as working the plantations, tilling the soil and cutting the stones. It has very troubling implications. It's a known fact that a number of children in the antebellum South were probably wet-nursed by a black female slave. Oftentimes, black mothers would have to give up their milk for the white owner's offspring, but not for their own children. The heinous practice of chattel slavery would ultimately serve to build the foundation for the issues that we see now regarding gender dynamics and toxic masculinity. Normally at this time I would go into a deep dive about the different decades since the abolition of chattel slavery, and all of the effects that it had on black men and women in this country. But this time I'm going to gloss over a lot of that, but just know that throughout the ensuing decades, all the way to the modern day, black men have been forced to work to support their families just like everyone else, and yet they're constantly under threat of having their freedom, their dignity, and their very lives taken from them by a cold and unfeeling society that does not want them to have independence. Black women experience gross and pervasive devaluing of their womanhood to this day. We saw all of this during Reconstruction. We saw this during Jim Crow. We saw this during the tough on crime 80s and 90s. We saw it during the recession in 2000s. We saw this during COVID, and we're seeing it now. So what does all that leave us with today? More importantly, how does that give us the likes of Nasheed and Tate and Samuels? You know that trope about the school bully? You know what I'm talking about, right? You got a kid that comes to school and uses and harasses his fellow students and beats them up and stuff. But then when you follow the kid back home and find out that he's actually in an abusive home himself, and he's probably good at fighting because he's had to fend off a grown man beating him up every night, you know the trope. When the bully comes back to school, that's where he retakes his power. That's where he reasserts himself. He's feeling a loss of personhood, a loss of humanity, a loss of autonomy. So he is taking the trauma of this inhumanity out on his peers when he has the opportunity to do so. It's a whole bunch of cascading effects, really. He's probably bigger or larger or stronger than his peers because usually children who are subjected to abuse tend to mature faster. He has an environment at home where he feels powerless, and beating up on his fellow students or extorting money from them or mouthing off in class and things like that is basically him regaining some sense of control over his life. The bully is being oppressed by the hierarchy that he is forced to live in, and the system around him has neglected to properly intervene and improve his situation. As a result, he has chosen to become an abuser himself. This may be a defense mechanism. This may be a survival mechanism. It might give him a leg up. By the way, important message for the parents out there, don't be your kid's first bully. Youth liberation is real. It's very important. Oftentimes, the first unjust hierarchy that we encounter in our lives as anarchists is the one in our own home. #youth liberation. But that is also another story for another video. So let's take that model and expand it to the plight of the black man in a modern America. It's been covered in detail about how black men's bodies are exploited and sold and objectified in the media and sports and in the business world. We are raised in a world where our worth is devalued, and we have to be uniquely excellent in any of our endeavors just to be given half the consideration of our white male peers. The entire justice system was built around policing our bodies and controlling our movements and ultimately incarcerating us. And make no mistake, at a very young age, black boys are extremely aware of this environment. So that's a whole lot to shoulder. At an age where you're still trying to figure yourself out. You don't know what you want to be. You don't know who you are. You may even be questioning your gender or sexuality. And now, coupled with the crushing, heightened expectations placed upon black men to succeed in a world that really wants them to fail. So what have you got left? Who can you turn to to guide you if you don't have that presence in the home. Or perhaps you do have that presence in the home, but they themselves are having their own struggles with a brutally unfair system that's trying to kick them down. Unfortunately, mass media is there and ready and willing to take in the minds of black boys, and whenever the media has been left to raise our children, it almost never turns out well. And this isn't me going on some anti-rap rant or some other colonizer nonsense. These are very real and easily traceable systemic reasons why black families are disproportionately impoverished. Gentrification, depressed wages, broken windows policing, and stop and frisk. My point is, there's a whole world out there that wants nothing more than to destroy black families. And what happens to the families that are caught up in this destruction? What happens to those families who fall victim to collateral damage from white supremacy and neoliberal capitalism? You have young men in an increasingly desperate or possibly hopeless situation, and they have nowhere to turn to when they feel powerless. There's been a lot of these Manosphere types out there lately, and one cannot ignore how many of them are men of color. Yes, there are white guys doing this as well. But your most egregious ones, the most loud and obnoxious ones right now, are the ones getting all of the press. Tariq Nasheed, Kevin Samuels, the Fresh and Fit podcast, Officer Tatum, Sneeko, Roosh V, Anthony Spade, the list goes on. These men looked at a series of systemic issues affecting them and their families, and they turned to a hyper-individualistic approach to solving the problem. The problem wasn't white supremacy in their eyes. The problem wasn't misogyny or toxic masculinity as far as they were concerned. They decided that the problem was, as a black men or men of color, that they weren't the ones being the patriarchs in the patriarchal society. So they create their platforms and build their audiences where they are kings of the hill. They are the men on top of the pile. They now get to feel the power of kicking down on women and LGBTQ people. They get to be the ones that sit in front of a massive audience and decry modernity and demand a return to rigid, strict patriarchal gender roles. Almost all of these losers are aggressively misogynist. They also tend to be very transphobic, homophobic, or just aligned in general against anyone who isn't a cis-het male like themselves. But do you want to know what the worst part is? There are very real conversations to be had about what American society is doing to the self-esteem and masculinity of black men. But that would involve these guys learning about and speaking on the systemic injustices and acknowledging the unjust hierarchy that we currently live in. They don't want to acknowledge the unjust hierarchy that we currently live in. They don't want to change the system. They just want the system to put someone else on top so that they can obtain the same benefits of the white man. Why am I talking about all of this? Shouldn't we just ignore these idiots? Kevin Samuels passed away recently. Tariq Nasheed is regularly getting dunked on Twitter and social media, and Andrew Tate just got deplatformed. So you would think that the best thing we can do is just ignore them and allow them to ultimately see the consequences of their own actions. And I admit, it's really tempting for me to just write off all of the fans of these guys and their financial supporters as dumb teenage boys and maidenless edgelord idiots sitting in their mom's basements.
Unfortunately for you, however, you are maidenless.
A number of those teenage boys are going to grow up to be grown men of color, and they're going to be interacting with women and other people as they become adults. At some point, some of these men are going to become fathers themselves, and they might have an opportunity to influence other young men and boys of color. We can't sit by and just passively expect all of this to just blow over. Men like this have existed for a long time, and now that they have the internet to use, they are amassing an enormous following on YouTube and Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. You have school teachers literally commenting that they're hearing 13, 14, 15-year-old boys in their class echoing the rhetoric of these guys. Maybe young men are drawn in because they are struggling with gaining social intelligence, and they are awkward, so they're having difficulty finding romantic partners. Maybe they're drawn into the oftentimes very ostentatious wealth and flaunting of a lot of these guys, a lot of these Manosphere content creators. They see their big fancy suits, their garish jewelry, their fast Italian exotic cars, and a menagerie of supermodels hanging onto their arms that totally aren't women that they paid to sit and stand around them. Or in the case of the Fresh and Fit podcast, unsuspecting female bloggers and models who they bring on the show get very drunk and then harass for hours on end. That being said, the good news. The good news is all is not lost. You do actually have an opportunity to intervene and counter the messaging of these Neanderthals. One thing that works in our favor. I get the distinct impression that a lot of them don't really read or research anything. One does not listen to Andrew Tate speak on just about any given subject and assume that he's ever read a book in his life. These guys dress and act like they Googled the phrase cool dude on the internet and then just copied over whatever came up in the image search results and made that into their entire personality. All of this is to say it's very easy to clown these idiots. Seriously, look at this. Do you actually feel intellectually threatened by any of this?
But do you really don't think that they're trying to emasculate the world and take away what it means to be a man?
Read the study. It's more likely men are
study,
outnumbered.
bro?
Study?
Google it.
What are you yelling?
I Googled are men smarter than women, and literally every single study says there's no difference.
Statements about, once a woman starts getting ready to give birth, her body is no longer her choice.
Yeah, that Anthony Spade video that I showed, this is the actual title of that video. How to give a combative Miss Woman a heavy dose of reality and still be cool. This is not a dunking channel. But come on, these guys make it really easy. And that's because their audience are not academics. Their audience are not mature grown men with responsibilities. Their audience is lonely teenagers and early 20-somethings who are looking for a cheat code to life and social interaction rather than learning how to talk to people and live in a society. Content like this gives them an excuse to never have to learn how to be a good person. There is a reason, after all, that there's so much overlap between MRAs and Sigma weirdos and pickup artists and anti-SJW culture and far-right reactionary political views. When you watch these kinds of content creators, they look at a broken system and a broken world, and instead of acknowledging the very real and systemic factors that are alienating us at a young age, they sell you on the idea of being an active part of that unjust hierarchy and making it benefit you. But take it from me. Take it from someone who grew up in the 90s. I witnessed all of the hyper-machizo gangster hip-hop and all of the big tough guy action movies and all of the big grandstanding pro athletes and sporting events. This stuff is toxic. It will poison you. It will kill you. It's not healthy. Because the running theme in a lot of this content is that you aren't the problem. Someone else is always to blame. But when you are peddling reactionary views, at a certain point you run out of imaginary foes, and the realization that part of the problem was you all along will hit you like a ton of bricks. You don't want to have that happen well into your 30s. A lot of ink has been spilled, and a lot of oxygen has been spent on this subject. There are a great many videos that dive way deeper into some of the different elements of the Manosphere. I mainly just want us to take the time to decolonize our minds and our conceptions of gender and sexuality. And we really need to do this because it's hurting us as men, and it's hurting the women in our society as well. Oh, remember the example I gave earlier about the black overseers and slave hunters in those slave movies? We all know the obvious truth, right? The message that all of these movies deliver when they show us these individuals. The overseer thinks he's a master over the black slaves, but the actual slave owner knows that the overseer is just another piece of property. This movement is steeped with white supremacy and colonialism, and the powers maintaining these unjust hierarchies don't actually have a place for these men of color in the Manosphere or the society that they want to see. Make no mistake. If they got the world they wanted to see, it wouldn't be long before they would be subjected to the same treatment as the rest of us. They're never going to let you in the club, bruh. And I don't know about you, but I'm a man, so that means I'm a protector and a provider. If you want to be a man, protect the women in your life. And provide a solid example for the young men around you. Oh, and get over yourself. And for those of you trying to make sure that content like this becomes obsolete, then might I suggest decolonization. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to like and subscribe. And for all of the men in the comments, let me know if you encountered any toxic male figures in your formative years. And if you want to make sure that you see more videos, be sure to click the bell to turn on notifications. Also be sure to follow me on Twitter at car_YZ, where you can pre-order a copy of my dating advice DVD. And if you're so inclined to support the channel, I do have a Patreon, and every little bit helps. Thanks again.